When the towering alien ships descended upon Earth, their silence was deafening, more terrifying than any declaration of war. Humanity's finest weapons had failed, diplomacy had fallen on deaf ears, and surrender seemed inevitable. But in the shadow of despair, a desperate plan emerged. They didn't need a warrior or a genius. They needed a voice sharp enough to cut through the void. And so, Earth turned to the unlikeliest of champions, Eminem, the rap legend whose words had once shaken the world. Could Slim Shady's razor-sharp wit and unapologetic defiance become humanity's last hope? It began with a silence unlike anything the people of Earth had ever experienced before. The sky had changed, a strange light blooming as if someone had spilled intergalactic paint all over the heavens. And from that light, they came. The ships. Massive and ominous, their hulking forms loomed above every major city, their sheer size dwarfing the skyline. They weren't hostile, not yet anyway, but the unsettling stillness that followed felt more menacing than any explosion or battle cry. At first, the reports were sparse and scattered. Whispers of strange shapes moving inside the ships, strange noises as if the skies themselves had become haunted. Governments scrambled to make sense of it all, sending drones and probes into the void, only to receive nothing but silence. Humanity held its breath, paralyzed by uncertainty. Was this the calm before the storm, or just a cosmic meh from some indifferent space tourists? No one had answers, and the waiting was driving everyone mad. Day by day, the alien presence became harder to ignore. They weren't just hovering anymore. They were building. Gigantic towers, stretching higher than any skyscraper ever dared. They sprouted up on every continent, casting their colossal shadows over once thriving cities. The once bustling metropolises now resembled ghost towns, crumbling beneath the oppressive gaze of alien steel monoliths. Humanity stood motionless, unsure whether they were here to conquer or just trying to outdo each other with taller and tackier structures. What did the aliens want? Were they here to enslave, subjugate? Or were they just checking Earth off some intergalactic bucket list of things to destroy? Nobody knew, and the not knowing gnawed at the very fabric of human existence. Humanity didn't have a choice but to accept their silent rulers. Every attempt to engage them militarily had ended in catastrophic failure. Our once vaunted technology, the very foundation of human dominance, crumbled against their relentless force. Nukes? Useless. Drones? Cute but ineffective. Even the most advanced war machines melted in their wake, like butter on a hot grill. Attempts to communicate with the aliens were met with silence. Radio waves sent out into the void, only to receive nothing but static. Not even a "we're busy, please hold" message from their end. If they were listening, they weren't talking back. Humanity was reduced to nothing more than ants beneath their indifferent gaze. The towers loomed larger with each passing day, and the people of Earth were left to wonder what was coming next. In the face of such uncertainty, panic set in. The streets grew quieter, the laughter and chatter of life replaced by the whispering wind of despair. Some called for surrender, believing there was no hope. Others spoke of resistance, unrealistic dreams of salvation, of humanity standing together against impossible odds. But no clear path forward revealed itself. They were trapped in a nightmare without a map, a compass, or even a GPS signal. And then, from the depths of despair, came an idea. Absurd, ridiculous, and utterly unexpected. It was the kind of idea that had no place in serious boardrooms or military war rooms. No one knew who had proposed it first. Was it a desperate scientist? A deluded politician? Someone drunk on hope and hubris? Regardless of the origin, the idea took root. They couldn't beat the aliens with weapons, but what if they used something different? Something the aliens wouldn't understand, something they couldn't ignore. Someone blurted it out like a bad joke. We need Slim Shady. At first, the room fell into a stunned silence. Then, the laughter began. Soft, at first, like the first hesitant chuckles of disbelief. Slim Shady. Really? The man who once rapped about mom's spaghetti and woke up the bathroom floor moments? How was his flow supposed to help humanity fight back against alien overlords? But as the absurdity of the suggestion settled in, a flicker of hope stirred. What if the aliens had never encountered something like Slim Shady before? What if his defiance, his razor-sharp tongue, his ability to outthink and out-rap the impossible, was the one thing they couldn't comprehend? After all, aliens weren't known for their love of rap battles or underground beefs. Maybe, just maybe, Slim Shady's ability to turn chaos into art was the key to breaking through the silence. And so, against all logic, they set their sights on the one man who had long since disappeared into the shadows of fame. The man who had once wielded his mic like a weapon of mass destruction, and now was nowhere to be found. In a quiet, dimly lit room, a small group of scientists, leaders, and desperate thinkers convened. The air was thick with tension, like the sort of silence you'd expect if someone sneezed, only no one dared to even breathe. Outside the window, the monstrous alien ships loomed like metal giants, casting their long, unrelenting shadows over the cities below. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to something inevitable. No one knew what. Maybe the end, maybe just more of the unbearable silence. One of them, a young researcher with wild eyes and an over-caffeinated grin, broke the quiet. His voice trembled as he spoke, almost as though the weight of his words could crush the very air around him. What if we bring someone they can't ignore? Laughter rippled through the group like a virus of incredulity. A few of the more practical minds scoffed, muttering under their breath. Someone leaned back in their chair, shaking their head. Who? Gandhi? Mother Teresa? Captain America? The researcher shot them a sharp glare. Number someone. Bigger. Someone they wouldn't just overlook. His gaze locked onto the leader of the council, who still clung to his silence like a life raft in a storm. The leader adjusted his collar, his hands visibly trembling as he struggled to maintain his composure. Someone. Who? Explain, before I have to call the men in white coats. The young researcher inhaled deeply and let the words tumble out. Eminem. Silence. It was the kind of silence that felt like the universe had just ground to a halt. Eminem? Slim Shady? The room filled with a mix of disbelief, confusion, and mild amusement. One council member leaned over, squinting at the researcher as if he had lost his mind. A rapper? Are you seriously suggesting we bring a rapper to fight space aliens? The researcher nodded, his gaze unwavering. Yeah, Eminem, Slim Shady. His voice held an intensity that defied the absurdity of his words. They've come to observe, right? Maybe they're waiting for us to scream back at them, but with something they've never heard before. Something unexpected. Laughter burst out again, but this time it wasn't as confident. The leader, still pale and rigid, leaned forward, massaging his temples. You're saying we're going to wage a war of words? Through rhymes and, what, lyrical dices? Exactly, the researcher said, leaning in. If their ships are just sitting there, observing, waiting for us to fold, then maybe, just maybe, Slim Shady's not just any voice. He's the right kind of crazy. One of the older council members sat forward. You believe Eminem can do what armies and missiles couldn't? What exactly is he going to do? Rhyme them into submission? More than that, the researcher insisted. It's not just his words, it's how he says them. His anger, his defiance. It's universal. Something about him breaks through barriers. We've seen it before. If we've lost everything else, why not give this a shot? We have nothing to lose but our pride. The leader, still skeptical, rubbed his temples as if he were trying to erase the madness from his mind. And you're sure? Eminem? Really? The researcher didn't hesitate. They won't expect it. They've seen our missiles, our generals, our leaders. But Slim Shady? They'll never see that coming. The room fell into silence once more. The idea was ludicrous, bordering on delusional. Yet, what if? What if this was the last, desperate act of humanity, grasping at straws in the face of impossible odds? The aliens had wiped out their military might, ignored their pleas for peace, and left humanity cowering in fear. What if, just maybe, Slim Shady's audacious defiance was the only weapon left? The leader sighed, his head in his hands. Well, it's not like we have any other ideas, he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. The researcher sat back, a small, almost smug smile on his face. Exactly. Because sometimes, when the entire world has gone silent, the only thing louder than fear is something that shouldn't even exist. The search for Eminem began in the shadows, conducted with the kind of urgency reserved for last-ditch efforts. Governments, military units, and covert agencies mobilized with the kind of zeal they usually reserved for finding lost nuclear codes or tracking down escaped lunatics. The man who had once been the voice of a generation had long since slipped into obscurity, retreating from the limelight like someone who'd accidentally wandered into a parallel universe of fame, only to find it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Rumors about Eminem's disappearance ran rampant. Some claimed he'd retired, others whispered he'd gone into hiding, overwhelmed by the weight of his own past. But those who truly knew the enigma that was Slim Shady knew better. They knew there was more to the man than his public persona. There had always been more, layers beneath the chaos, the rage, and the fire that had once burned in his eyes. They scoured old records like archaeologists digging through ancient ruins. Interviews, documentaries, obscure fan forums, and grainy footage from the early 2000s. Anything that might offer a clue to his whereabouts. They spoke to the few who had once walked in his shadow. Friends, producers, the people who had known the man before he became a myth. It wasn't easy. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign. Eminem had become a ghost, a forgotten relic of the past. But they pressed on. Desperation wasn't just the fuel, it was the only thing keeping them moving forward. Finally, someone, an exhausted, underpaid analyst, stumbled onto a trace. A tiny breadcrumb that led to a modest home in Detroit. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. When they arrived at the address, they found themselves standing in front of an unassuming house, its paint chipped and windows foggy. The kind of place that felt like it had been forgotten by time itself. They knocked on the door, and when it opened, they were met with a pair of eyes that could only belong to someone who'd seen more than their fair share of chaos. Eminem. Older now, grizzled beard, weathered skin, and the unmistakable weight of years pressing down on him. His slim figure had thickened, and the fire that once burned so fiercely had dimmed, but it was still there, lurking beneath the surface. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, his voice as sharp as ever, cutting through the silence like a knife. His skepticism wasn't just evident, It radiated off him in waves. The men in suits didn't flinch. They didn't have time for fear. "We need you," they said, their voices laced with urgency. "We need Slim Shady." He stared at them, his brow furrowed, confusion and irritation mixing like an unholy cocktail. "Slim who?" One of the agents stepped forward, pulling out a worn photo of the alien ships hovering above Earth. "These things. They've come, and we're out of options. We've tried everything. Military, diplomacy, science. Nothing works. But then, we remembered you. We need someone who can challenge them in a way they'll understand. Someone they can't ignore. And that someone is you." Eminem frowned, his eyes narrowing, his lip curling in the kind of disdain that suggested he'd heard it all before. He crossed his arms, his gaze drifting toward the photo as though trying to comprehend what they were saying. "I retired," he muttered, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Left all that behind." "Yeah," one of the agents said, "but we didn't forget. And neither did they." Eminem took a long, deliberate breath. His mind raced through the flood of memories, the moments when his music had mattered, when his words had carried weight. The critics had dismissed him, the fans had grown distant, but deep down, he had never stopped being Slim Shady. He hadn't changed, not really. The world had changed around him, but the fire, the anger, those had always been there, waiting. He turned back to the agents, his smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You want Slim Shady?" His tone was laced with mockery. "You got him!" The agents exchanged glances, trying to suppress their relief. "Good," one of them said. "We'll get you up to speed. The world's counting on you, Shady." Eminem shook his head, but there was no humor in his smirk now. "The world?" "Nah," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "They stopped counting on me a long time ago." But as he stepped back into his house, closing the door behind him, the fire in his eyes wasn't just old. It was something far from extinguished. In a world now dominated by towering alien structures that pierced through the clouds, humanity prepared for its last stand. The few remaining communication satellites had been commandeered, their signals hijacked, their frequencies flooded with a message of defiance. What was left of Earth's media, flickering screens, crackling radios, and dying transmitters, was now dedicated to one thing: broadcasting the message to the aliens, to the humans, and to the void. Eminem stood before a crowd of scientists, generals, and a world that had long since given up hope. His stance was defiant, his expression colder than the void itself. His voice, once the roar of rebellion, now carried the weight of desperation. But there was no surrender in it. "Listen up, you alien bastards," Eminem growled, his voice cutting through the static like a blade. The airwaves trembled under the force of his words. "You think you can come down here, take over our planet, and we'll just roll over? Think again." The world held its breath as the transmission spread. No one could believe what they were hearing. Eminem wasn't offering peace or begging for mercy. His words were a challenge, sharp and unfiltered. The aliens watched from above, their giant ships unmoving, their vast presence looming in silence. Were they watching in amusement, confusion, curiosity? No one knew. All that was clear was that they weren't responding. But Eminem didn't care. His glare wasn't for them. It was for humanity, the world watching on the brink of destruction. "You might have your towers, your tech, your ships," Eminem continued, his tone rising like a storm. His voice reverberated through every living room, every cracked speaker, and every desperate heart. "But we've got something you'll never understand. We've got rage. We've got voices. We've got something you'll never take." His words weren't just defiance. They were a battle cry from a world that had lost everything, yet still refused to surrender. It wasn't just noise, it was a declaration that they would fight with whatever they had left. The broadcast wasn't just a message, it was a call. A rallying cry for anyone still clinging to hope. The aliens, towering and unfeeling, watched on. Their silence was fractured, their attention finally stirred. Back on Earth, the atmosphere wasn't one of hope, but of desperation. People turned to each other, searching for meaning in the chaos, holding on to something, anything, that might give them purpose. Eminem's voice, raw and unrelenting, echoed louder. "We're not gonna sit here and wait for you to decide our fate. We're gonna fight. We're gonna rise from the ashes and tell you exactly where to stick it." His words weren't just for the aliens, they were for everyone still standing. It wasn't pretty, but it was real. As his broadcast continued, the aliens above began to shift. Not in a coordinated, mechanical way, but something subtle, a flicker of movement. The silence wasn't absolute anymore. It was as if they had heard something they hadn't expected. Something that didn't fit into their grand, cold calculations of dominance. Eminem could feel it in his bones. The quiet above wasn't the same anymore. Something had cracked, whether in them or in him or in the world below. He didn't stop. "You think you've won? You think this is over? Hell no. This is just the beginning." His words dripped with defiance, carrying echoes across a world that no longer knew what normal meant. And as the broadcast stretched on, the once unrelenting silence of the alien ships began to falter. Maybe, just maybe, Slim Shady wasn't just a relic of the past. Maybe, just maybe, he was the voice humanity needed to rise again. For days, there was silence from the alien ships. Humanity clung to whatever hope remained, though they knew deep down that silence had never been their friend. The military had tried everything, strategies, weapons, alliances, and all of it had been crushed under the weight of the aliens' towering indifference. Then, suddenly, without warning, the alien towers began to shimmer. It wasn't a crackle of energy or a burst of light, but something subtler, like the air itself had shifted, humming with an unnatural frequency. A soundless pulse radiated through the atmosphere, setting the world on edge. Slowly, methodically, the colossal alien ships began to descend, their movements deliberate, their size overwhelming. But it wasn't a show of force. It wasn't a conquering march. No explosions, no lightning bolts, no thunderous roars that would have sent humanity running. Instead, they hovered closer to the ground, lowering themselves gently, the cold metal now casting long shadows across the planet. Eminem watched from a distance, his expression one of quiet disbelief. The world, too, stood motionless, frozen in a mix of awe and fear, waiting for whatever came next. Then, from the tallest, most imposing ship, a figure emerged. It wasn't monstrous or terrifying like they had imagined. It wasn't an alien beast dripping with claws and tentacles. No, this was something different. It looked familiar, faintly human-like, but there was something off. Its features were close to human, but there was an otherworldly essence to it. Something subtle, something alien. The figure's voice broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried, distant, yet unnervingly clear. "Your words." They reached us. There was a collective gasp from the crowd below. They understood the language, Earth's language, but the meaning of the words felt foreign. Alien. The figure continued, its tone curious but distant. "We did not expect defiance. We did not expect you to fight." Eminem stepped forward, his gaze locked on the creature. His voice was sharp, unrelenting. "Well, guess what? Slim Shady doesn't back down. The creature paused, tilting its head in what seemed like a mix of confusion and contemplation. It stared at Eminem for what felt like an eternity, its glowing eyes studying him in a way no human had been studied before. Then, slowly, it turned back toward the towering ships above. The silence between them stretched out longer than anyone had expected. The aliens, those beings from beyond the stars, seemed unsettled. For the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in their otherwise unyielding silence. It was a hesitation that sent a ripple through the crowd below. Could it be? Could something as seemingly insignificant as a human, no, a rapper, have broken through their calculated endless void? Eminem stood tall, his shoulders squared, the weight of the world, and now perhaps even the fate of humanity, resting on him. His eyes locked onto the alien figure, the same fire he'd always had, burning brighter than ever. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The creature finally spoke again, its voice slower, more deliberate. "You challenge us." "Why?" Eminem didn't flinch. "Because it's what I do," he said, his tone dripping with defiance. "I spit bars that cut deeper than any weapon. I'm not here to beg or plead. I'm here to tell you, this is our planet, our home, and we're not going down without a fight." The alien creature watched him, its expression unreadable. Then, it turned its gaze back to the towering ships. The once immobile giants above began to shift. A flicker of movement, subtle yet undeniable. Eminem could feel it. Something had shifted, not just in the aliens, but in the air itself. It wasn't just the silence. It was as if the very fabric of their invasion had cracked, splintered beneath his words. The creature turned back to Eminem, its voice softer now. "You speak of defiance, of fight. We did not understand these things." Eminem smirked. "Well, guess what? You're about to." The figure hesitated once more, its gaze lingering on the crowd below. The towering alien ships above stirred, their massive forms flickering with uncertainty. Eminem took a step forward, his voice growing louder. "We're not some helpless species waiting for you to decide our fate. We've got something you don't. We've got spirit. We've got fight. And we're not backing down." The aliens watched, and for the first time, the silence between them was not one of control. It was one of contemplation, of doubt. And somewhere above, in the heart of those colossal ships, something unseen had begun to unravel. The days that followed were a strange kind of limbo. The towering alien ships still hovered above Earth, their massive presence looming like silent sentinels. But the world had changed. The once oppressive fear that had consumed humanity had dimmed, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. The aliens had neither attacked nor made any further moves, leaving everyone on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Eminem, now more than ever, felt the weight of his challenge. His bravado had been loud, his defiance bold. But had it made a real difference? Had the aliens even heard him? Or had his words been nothing more than echoes lost in the endless void? The nagging doubt gnawed at him, crawling into his thoughts like an unwelcome guest. It wasn't until the reports began pouring in from every corner of the globe that the true impact of his broadcast became clear. At first, the news was fragmented and surreal. Strange tremors were being felt in cities that had stood frozen in fear. Alien structures, once towering monuments to their dominance, were beginning to shift. No, not shift. Collapse. One by one, the massive towers began to crumble, their foundations cracking like brittle ice. The once invincible symbols of their alien overlords fell into ruin. Cities that had lived in the shadow of those towering fortresses now stared up at an empty sky. Humanity watched in stunned disbelief. What had once felt like an impossible nightmare was becoming reality. The fear of invasion, the weight of helplessness, they had vanished, leaving behind only echoes of something greater. The aliens had left, retreating from the very planet they had sought to conquer. No one could explain why. No one dared to believe it. But the evidence was undeniable. The alien towers were crumbling. Eminem stood at the edge of what was left of his world, his gaze locked on the empty expanse of the sky. The alien ships still loomed above, but something was different. The awe, the terror, everything was gone. It was as if the very threat had been erased. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Guess Slim Shady really does have a way with words," he muttered to himself, the weight of disbelief evident in his voice. For a man who had built a career on spitting truth, on turning pain into lyrics that cut deep, this was something he couldn't quite wrap his head around. Could his words really have been the catalyst for the alien retreat? Was it possible that Defiance, no matter how absurd, had shattered the unbreakable silence that had defined their arrival? He chuckled quietly, though there was no humor in it. "Guess I'm not just any rapper. I'm the last line of defense against the end of the world." It sounded ridiculous. Even to him, standing there in the ruins of what was once civilization, it felt utterly absurd. Yet, deep down, there was a gnawing certainty that his challenge had been heard. The aliens had understood something they hadn't expected: the fire, the rage, the sheer unwillingness to surrender. "They didn't want to fight," Eminem mused, his voice almost drowned out by the silence. "But maybe they never understood what we had to lose." He turned slowly, taking in the vast emptiness around him. The world he once knew, the world he had grown up in, was gone. All that remained was rubble, and the memory of towering ships that had once seemed invincible. And yet, even in this desolation, there was a strange sense of freedom. Humanity had endured. They had survived, perhaps because of words, of defiance, of something as simple as a man who refused to back down. Eminem closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool wind brush against his face. It was the first time he felt the weight lift, if only slightly. The aliens were gone, or at least they weren't here anymore. The silence that had once crushed them all was no longer their enemy. As he walked away from the edge of the world, the ruins stretching out before him, he thought one last time about the ship hovering above. Maybe they were watching still, or maybe they had already left. Either way, one thing was certain: the world had changed, and so had he. Slim Shady had spoken, and sometimes that's all it takes. In the days that followed, the world began to piece itself back together. The towering alien ships, once looming over every city, were gone. The streets that had once been eerily silent were now alive with the cautious whispers of hope. Humanity had survived, though the reason why remained a mystery, one that no scientist or historian could fully explain. The alien towers, once imposing symbols of their dominance, were nothing but crumbling ruins. Dust and debris blanketed the once busy metropolises, leaving behind only echoes of the past. No one knew exactly where the aliens had gone, or if they would ever return. Some believed they had been defeated. Others whispered of something far more unsettling: that the aliens had been shaken, perhaps beyond repair, by something they couldn't fathom. Eminem, the unlikely hero, had slipped back into the shadows once again. His defiance, his challenge to the cosmic forces, had become a legend, spoken of in hushed tones around campfires, in quiet gatherings, and in the halls of history. He had disappeared just as mysteriously as he had appeared, his mission completed, leaving behind only his words and the knowledge that sometimes the most unexpected voices could shape the future. News of Slim Shady spread across the globe like wildfire, his name now synonymous with humanity's survival. Statues were erected, murals painted in cities once overwhelmed by despair. The man who had once rapped about struggles, pain, and anger was now hailed as a symbol of resilience, a figure whose defiance had cut through the void. No one could fully understand how words had become their weapon. After all, humanity had always relied on technology, military might, and reason to defend itself. But what Slim Shady had wielded wasn't any of those things. His words had carried a power they hadn't expected. They had struck a nerve in the alien consciousness, one they couldn't ignore. The reports came in from everywhere. The alien towers, which had once dominated the horizon, had started to crumble from the inside out. No one knew if they had malfunctioned or if the aliens had abandoned them out of fear. But whatever the cause, the results were the same. The colossal structures fell, one by one, leaving behind nothing but ruins and a strange emptiness. The scientists could only speculate. Perhaps the aliens had been shaken by something they couldn't comprehend. The defiance of a single man who had spoken words they didn't understand, words they couldn't comprehend. Maybe they had underestimated the very essence of human resilience, something far greater than any weapon they could bring. For Eminem, the days of public recognition were long gone. After all, he had never been one to seek fame. He returned to the obscurity he thrived in, his place in the world forever changed. No longer just the man who rapped about survival and struggle, he had become something much more. A symbol of defiance, a hero born from the ashes of humanity's darkest hour. In a world where stories often fade into the background, Eminem's would remain forever etched in the annals of history. His name became a rallying cry, whispered in moments of doubt, spoken in times of fear. Generations to come would hear tales of the man who dared to challenge the impossible, and won. The aliens may have left, but they left behind more than just ruins. They left behind questions, mysteries, and a legacy that would outlive even them. No one knew what they had been, where they had come from, or why they had come. But they had departed, and humanity had lived to tell the tale. And Slim Shady? His defiance had become a legend, a testament to the power of words, the power of hope, and the power of someone who refused to give up.